everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. I am really looking forward to speaking with this week's guest. So this week I'm going to be talking with Steve Johnson. Now, Steve is a psychologist based in Sydney, Australia. He has a rich history in sports psychology and mainstream psychology. He was, for 7 years, a sports psychology and sport coaching lecturer and tutor at Sydney University, Western Sydney, University of Wollongong. He's been a performance psychologist for elite athletes and teams, including from sports such as tennis, rugby league, super rugby, international level swimming, football, cricket, and a variety of other sports. Now, several years ago, Steve started the Wellbeing Science Institute, and that was born out of a desire to help create more flourishing cities, communities, organisations and individuals. He does a lot of work through the Institute in sport, and the backbone of the approach he takes lies in a holistic, positive and developmental well-being perspective, supported by evidence-based science. And his institute has a few firsts to its name. He has designed the world's first nationally recognised training programme for elite athlete well-being management. He's authored the first undergraduate sports psychology degree in the Southern Hemisphere, and designed and delivered the first government-approved course for personal trainers in Australia. So this is going to be a fascinating conversation over the next hour or so. Steve, thank you so much for joining us from sunny Australia.
Great to be with you, Dan. Unfortunately, I can report sunny Australia is actually raining today, so beautiful on the weekend, but not so great today, but great to be with you.
Well, I think then for the first time ever, I'm looking out the window and it's beautiful blue skies here in England. It's I'm not going to say it's warm, but it's beautiful blue skies. So 1-0 to England for a change on the weather front. So, Steve, did I get that biog right? Am I sort of accurate with your background, with your backstory in psychology?
Yes, yeah, and I actually went into sports psychology at the time because I didn't really feel that the psychological models and the schools of psychology offered enough potential for what was really positive and what was right with people. And I had to be very patient until Martin Seligman came along in the late 90s and early 2000s with the whole school of positive psychology. And I thought that was then the time where I could really step back in wholeheartedly into psychology, because it was actually about human potential, not pathology.
Interesting. So, listening to what you're saying there, so back in the 90s you were trained a licensed psychologist, but you weren't convinced by what you were seeing at the time. Martin Seligman comes along with his ideas of positive psychology. So when you think back, what models, when you say I wasn't convinced by the models, and I find that interesting because this is when sort of the early to mid 90s, this is when I started to get interested as a teenager, getting into golf and sort of playing full-time golf after leaving school. I was into reading a lot of the sports psychology books, sports psychology literature. So what didn't you like about it? What didn't you like about the literature out there at that time?
Well, sports psychology was unusual in the sense that compared to mainstream schools of psychology, it was actually about development and potential, and it was about achievement and all of the possibilities of human endeavour. But if you looked at mainstream psychology, and depending on what school of psychology one adhered to, the idea was that humans had problems, and the best we could do for those problems was potentially relieve their suffering. And a lot of investment went into that area, and a lot of investment of psychologists and psychiatry and pharmaceutical companies, and I think it both sold psychology short, and I think he's been highly influential in where we find ourselves today with what I would call a lot of the well-being issues, psychological and mental health well-being issues that we find today, because we invested so much time in that area. And because of that investment in time, that also meant that we didn't invest as heavily on the other side as to how to equip people with the knowledge and skills to allow them to take care of their well-being.
So do you think that pathological approach to psychology has led to that sort of general opinion about sports psychology? Well, I only see a sports psychologist if I've got a problem. It's not about growth and being the best that I can be. It's a case of, if I've got a problem, I will go and see a sports psychologist. Do you think that that's where that attitude towards psychology or sports psychology stems from?
And I think that's true both in sports psychology and in mainstream psychology. And so, for example, if someone was to say an athlete has a mental health problem, we actually automatically assume that athlete has a mental ill health problem and will be off receiving treatment for that athlete mental ill health. And for me, that's fairly problematic, because the majority of athletes can benefit from proactive, holistic and developmental knowledge and skill acquisition, which means they can lead a flourishing life as well as be successful performers.
You think that they go hand in hand? You think a flourishing life, being an elite performer, both of them complement and augment each other? Being an elite athlete doesn't require the kind of sacrifice that might lend itself to some kind of neurosis or some kind of maladaptive, dysfunctional form of thinking.
I think that elite athlete or professional athlete environments, by their very nature, are high pressure. They create unique stresses on people. But I do think that, and the research is starting to bear this out, that over time, with the acquisition of the right knowledge and the right skills, athletes are better able to take care of themselves, that support staff are better able to support athletes, and coaches are better able to understand the experience of the elite athlete if they haven't been an elite athlete themselves, and then from the coach's perspective, understand the right time to push, the right time to be assertive, the right time to have high expectations, and the right time to back off as well.
Getting the balance between stretch and support.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So Martin Seligman comes along, University of Pennsylvania, and in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, and starts to produce this wonderful literature on positive psychology. Steve Johnson, on the other side of the world, starts to read this, and positive psychology spreads through authorship of books, journal articles. So how do things progress for you from there? How do you start to get involved more in this area?
Well, my first reaction, I'm sure, like a lot of people, was, well, finally, here we have a field of psychology, a school of thought around psychology, which the majority of people can relate to. And from my own perspective, what I saw here was a perfect alignment of how sports psychology and mainstream psychology could actually come together and be useful for the mainstream population and for athletes and the world of sport. Because what Seligman was actually talking about was creating positive emotions, having valuable and significant relationships, having a sense of meaning, having a sense of accomplishment. So all the things which are germane to athletes and sporting environments, but also saying, look, it's not just about sport, it's not about sport, but actually this is about mainstream psychology. So that provided, in my view, a great opportunity for sports psychologists to look at mainstream psychology and say, look, we can add value, both in sporting environments, but just to people in general, as well as organisations. And sporting organisations are full of athletes and coaches and officials, but they're also organisations, and they're also full of people who just happen to work for a sporting organisation. So I think what this model of psychology did was be able to provide a positive school of thought around psychology, which could be brought in at the enterprise level.
So that led you to start the Wellbeing Science Institute. So tell us a bit more about your institute, how it functions in sport, the models you're creating within your courses. So
one of the early catalysts for setting up the institute was I was asked by one of the big sporting codes here in Australia, the NRL, to design a proactive and holistic program for people who work with NRL players.
Who's the NRL, Steve?
And the NRL is the National Rugby League, and it's one of the primary sport codes in Australia. It has a significant broadcast rights deal. It's one of the top 3 sports in Australia, and without doubt one of the most professional codes in the world when it comes to athlete wellbeing. And what the NRL was trying to do was it was trying to support its athletes by training people who work with, who are specifically in the role to support the well-being of athletes, but give those people the knowledge and skills so that they could work with elite athletes, in this case rugby league players, and help them acquire the skills that could help them manage their physical well-being, their psychological well-being, their relationships, their awareness around culture and spirituality, to ensure they had a career plan outside of rugby league, and to start thinking about their finances, because for most athletes their income tends to rapidly fall off a cliff once they finish their athletic careers, and really start putting that all into a programmatic process that allowed each individual athlete to have a personalised and customised wellbeing plan. So it was a pretty big mandate, and it was a pretty big request, and it hadn't been done before anywhere in the world.
And so how did that work? Did you go from club to club? Did you do it sort of people came to you, clubs came to you? How did that process actually function?
The process was I was fortunate that after I walked out of the world of sport for a number of years, I decided it was time to go and learn some new things, and went on an executive path. But one of the things I spent a lot of time doing was working in organisational change, and I think that was really helpful because it got me thinking of this assignment as a change process. So the first thing that I thought we needed was a wellbeing model, because whenever you're talking about wellbeing, one of the first questions that will always come up will be, what's your wellbeing model? So the first assignment was to do a lot of research, look around the world and say, okay, well, what wellbeing models are out there, and what model would actually work in the NRL. So that was my first assignment. So in identifying what the potential opportunities were for wellbeing models, I then had to say, well, if this is going to work inside the organisation, how is it going to resonate with the people who actually do the work? And so then what we formed was a stakeholder group made up of wellbeing managers, and it was their role to provide input and support for both the wellbeing model, the processes, the tools, and the training, which we eventually developed. So the first step was to identify what we meant by well-being, then so to come up with effective definition. And for us, the definition of well-being was to help athletes move toward their potential as people and to live their life in a valued way. So, and that was really instructive, because what we were talking about was helping people move toward their potential. And then it didn't matter where people started, didn't necessarily matter where people finished, but provided the opportunity for effectively a level playing field. And so, having defined what we meant by well-being and then developed a well-being model, we could then start saying, okay, what would be the components and how would we explain these components to athletes? So we spent a couple of months working out what that well-being model would look like. And then we had to ask ourselves, well, if that was the well-being model, how would we get athletes to engage with it? And that's where, the importance of Seligman's philosophy, because that was one of the underpinning philosophies, and his PERMA model of psychological well-being, and the theory of self-determination, where we weren't going to be telling players where their focus should be, but rather asking them what were the areas they'd like to work on. And then we also had to say, okay, if we were able to get players to engage with this idea of well-being, then how would that work? And then how would we measure well-being? So we came up with some unique ways of how we'd actually get players to engage with well-being, and then also how we would measure it, both in a subjective sense and then in an objective sense. So that process of just going through those steps outlined took around 6 months.
Okay, really interesting. So I've written down 4 words. Listen to you there. What I hear is definition, components, engagement, measurement. Definition, components, engagement, measurement. As in, we needed to define well-being. We needed to come up with specific components relevant to well-being. We needed to engage players, engage athletes, and then measure that sort of before engagement and during engagement and after engagement. It measure the effectiveness. Going back, just drilling down on those areas. So definition, really, really interesting. Something you said here. You define it as helping athletes move towards their potential as people. And I find that really interesting, because you've been engaged by the National Rugby League, the NRL, which, as you alluded to, is highly competitive, one of the most professional leagues in the world. And I think the general consensus would be, or the perception would be, that the NRL want world-class players, world-class sporting achievement, entertaining crowds, entertaining stadiums full of people. Yet they were happy to go with this notion of, we want to help our athletes move towards potential as people. How does that reconcile with elite sport? How does that reconcile with sports people being the very best that they can be on the pitch, on the training pitch, on the match day, the game day pitch? How does that actually work, Steve?
Well, I think it works perfectly, in the sense that if you're functioning well as a human being, then that makes it a lot easier for you to function effectively as an athlete. And I think all the evidence, suggests that's the case. But I think you can definitely have, you can be functioning well as a human being and not function well as an athlete. But what's really interesting is that the NRL actually agreed to separate out performance and well-being, and for the athletes to focus on well-being. And I think it's an extremely brave decision, but I think it's an important one, because athletes get supported in their athletic endeavours through their coaching staff, through the high performance staff, through the medical staff, and the NRL took the view that the clubs, or the franchises, if you like, had quite significant support for the athletes on the performance side, but what they were concerned about was whether or not they had enough support on the wellbeing side, because there were certain markers where we would see potential falls in an athlete's well-being, and they became almost predictive. So, for example, if an athlete got a long-term injury, well, we would know that, chances are that would affect their not only their physical health, but their mental health. If their relationships were travelling poorly, that would affect their not just their on-field performance, but again, potential impacts on their mental health. We know that athletes who over-identify with their athlete identity have problems when it comes to the conclusion of their careers. So in many ways it was a brave decision by the NRL, but I think it was a smart one, because what they were effectively doing was separating out the resourcing of well-being from the resourcing of high performance. And very few sporting organisations are willing to make that investment.
Steve, you had me at hello. I'm completely, clearly in my position, and I help athletes with wellbeing challenges. I work with coaches to help athletes with wellbeing challenges. The challenge for us is to convince, as you say, governing bodies, organisations, coaches of the value of this. And I think if one drills down to the real nitty-gritty behind this, for me, if you have a competitor with ability, with, dare I use the word, talent, helping that competitor be the very best that they can be, I think requires investment in helping them function optimally, becoming a high-functioning individual in society. I think if a player, if an athlete is engaged in stress every single day and they're releasing that good old hormone cortisol, the stress hormone, every day, how can they be the very best that they can be? How can they function effectively in training? Now, I suppose there is complexity there, isn't there, Steve, whereby perception can mediate things. As in, if you've got an athlete with off-field challenges, hasn't got their stuff together off the field, off the pitch, but once they step foot onto the pitch, they're able to put that behind them and optimise their playing time and playing ability on the pitch. Some athletes can do that, but when coaches say that to me, Steve, for me, I would always come back with, well, what evidence have you got that player can't be even better than they are now? Why put that burden on them to have to, just automatically by magic forget what's happening off the pitch?
Yeah, and I would add to that, how sustainable will their performance be? And then I would add a more humanistic view to it as well and say, well, what happens when they stop playing their particular sport and they're unable to perform? What happens to the person's life? So I think to me, there's a moral piece here that we're also saying, look, we all want the athlete to perform at their best, but we also want to take care of the person, both during and after their athletic careers. And I think increasingly it's become an occupational health and safety issue, but it's also become the kind of issue that sporting codes who are following this approach are sending a very powerful message to their to their athletes about the fact they really care about them as people, not just as commodity athletes.
What are the components, Steve? You define well-being as athletes moving towards their potential as people.
Mm-hmm.
There was a second part of that definition, which you'll remind me of in a second, but what are the components behind that? What specific things are you helping coaches with their ability to be able to do, to be able to engage players with? What specific things are you saying to players? Are you working on with players? What are the components?
Yes, well, as it turns out, the second part of that definition is important because, and that is, it's to help the athlete move toward their potential as a person and live their life in a valued way.
Okay.
And for us, what that meant was living a life which is aligned to their values. And so one of the key pieces of this approach to well-being was to enable athletes to become more self-aware. And so learning about one's values and learning about one's character strengths is fundamental to becoming more other self-aware. And what we know is if people become more self-aware, then that translates into them becoming more other-aware, which then leads to better quality relationships because they can connect, they understand another person's position, they can connect on a physical level, a psychological level, an emotional level, and so therefore the quality of relationships improve. Now, those kind of skills or that kind of knowledge and those kind of skills, they're good skills for life, not just for your athletic careers, to have a better relationships with your teammates and the coaching staff and the head coach. So these skills, translate into sport, but they also translate extremely well into life for the long term.
You've mentioned that word self-aware.
Yeah.
And this is something I work on with players and coaches all the time. How are you helping coaches help players become more self-aware?
So in the NRL, every club or franchise has 2 wellbeing managers.
Okay.
And so they're the people who are charged with helping the athletes move toward their potential as people, and they're the people responsible for helping the athlete construct their own personal wellbeing plan. So the other piece that I didn't mention, we spent a significant investment of time, was getting these wellbeing managers qualified. And that was the purpose of this this course which we developed, which was recognised by the national government, and now is being rolled out wider than the NRL, and it's the first program of its kind in the world where there's a national qualification in elite athlete wellbeing management, which gives the people who work with elite athletes the knowledge and the skills so they can genuinely support elite athletes and their well-being. So rather than waiting until there's a problem and then we send the person off to the psychologist or the psychiatrist, we actually invest in helping athletes develop the knowledge and skills and having a plan for how they can look after their own well-being.
So it's proactive rather than reactive.
Totally proactive.
Yeah. Now, what I know is that we will be having grassroots coaches listening to this and thinking, you know what, Steve, that sounds awesome. I love that. That's brilliant. But my little club, based in the north of England, the south of England, all over, somewhere in the world, wherever it might be, my club that has very few resources, and I've got my couple of sessions a week for an hour and a half per session, and we've got to use our resources to rent out the AstroTurf pitch, and it's a wet Wednesday evening, and there's just not a lot of time. And how do from the work that you're doing in well-being, and if you want to focus on self-awareness, you can, or another branch of positive psychology, how can grassroots coaches help their players with this stuff?
Well, I think, look, here's the great thing about the internet is all this information is out there. And as long as the coaches have the right philosophy, i.e. they're willing to coach the person and the athlete, so very much the John Wooden school of coaching, if you like, then the information is out there and it's available from credible sources. For example, you can do courses in positive psychology at some of the best universities in the world for free. And all you need to do is go online, Google Coursera or any other MOOC, and you can find a course that can be done at, Harvard or Penn State or Yale, some of the best schools in the world, and you can learn about, important topics of well-being. And I'll just give you a simple example. With teenagers, one of the most important things for their well-being is sleep. But most people don't know what it takes to get a good night's sleep. They don't know what good sleep hygiene practices are, and they don't know the beneficial effects of getting good sleep on cognitive function, on mood, on athletic performance. So just simply doing some simple research around what are good sleep hygiene practices, getting people to self-evaluate their current practices and making some minor modifications can have a significant impact on well-being. Likewise, educating, particularly kids and teenagers around good nutrition. That's a fairly simple thing to be able to do. Likewise, practicing some level of self-regulation, whether that be simple breathing techniques or mindfulness training or meditation or yoga exercises. These are all things which help kids and teenagers self-regulate. And then if they can self-regulate, they can be calmer. And if they're calmer, they can learn more effectively, whether it be in an academic or a sporting environment. So there are all these things that, even if you are the coach in, the north of England who coaches the local soccer team, there are all these things that potentially people can do. And the information and the knowledge is out there. But one of the things that we really believe is that getting qualified really makes a difference. So acquiring the knowledge and acquiring the skills yourself so that then you can help other people. And that was the real motivation behind getting this Certificate 4 program up. And if for your international listeners, a Certificate 4 program sits between universities and colleges, and generally takes somewhere between 600 to 1,000 hours of study, face-to-face classes, doing research assignments, doing group work and reading. So it's not a pushover. It's a qualification. So there's an expectation there that people will do a reasonable amount of work.
Just drilling down a bit deeper on some of the specific tools, techniques, methodologies that you use. So this brings it to life for people if they're going to make a decision about doing your course. Again, I'm going to, because I think what we're guilty of, whether it's sports psychology or sports science, coaching, is we forget that 99.9% of coaches are at grassroots level. Some are volunteer, most are volunteers. Vast majority don't get paid for what they do. Just to bring this alive a little bit, let's imagine that let's imagine that you're say a coach of under 16s or under 18s or under 14s, you can choose any sport you desire. What specific approach might you take to help improve self-awareness of your players? What little ideas could you use to help them improve their self-awareness? And again, Steve, if you want to pick another well-being area, please do.
Yeah, look, I think there's a couple of things, and I actually do work with the under 16s representative team for New South Wales Rugby League, and that's not so much on the wellbeing side, but the performance side. But I've also had a hand in developing their wellbeing strategy, and the things we talk to them about is, again, becoming self-aware. So we get them to do the adolescent version of the VIA Strengths Survey, because most people don't understand that they actually have, a group of, let's call them signature strengths that they deploy every day. So we get these young teenagers to do the free signature strength survey from the VIA organization in the US, and then we sit down and have a conversation around, well, what are your strengths? And then we get them to share them with their teammates so that their teammates understand, look, this person might play, let's say they play the position of, halfback, or they play in the forwards, but actually in terms of character strengths, what's really important to them is spirituality, or what's really important to them is leadership, or what's important to them is humility. So then they start to see their teammates not just as, positional teammates on a team playing in a representative team, but actually see them more as people. And so, but that starts with them understanding what their strengths are as a person, not necessarily as an athlete, but as a person, and that how that plays into their awareness of other people and the people around them. So we use that exercise.
Fantastic. So what I hear you say there, Steve, is your under 16 team will be in a room, and each individual will have the opportunity to talk about their strength characteristics.
So we get them to go to the VIA site, which is viacharacter.org, and there you can undertake the VIA Adolescent Survey, and it'll give you a free summary of your character strengths. Now, if you want to pay a little extra, you can get, and just for the record, I've got no affiliation, financial or otherwise, with the organisation, but it just happens to be a really good tool, which, by the way, was developed by Martin Seligman and Chris Peterson. And so we get these reports for the players, and then we sit down and discuss them with them. And so they've got this report which says, look, here are your character strengths based on your results, your responses to the questions. Here's a summary of your character strengths. Oh, and by the way, you've got these, top 5 or top 7 here, which we call your signature strengths, which are the ones that are going to make you feel most authentic, most alive. You're going to feel most satisfied when you get to use them. So let's talk about a time when maybe you've used this strength in the last week. What was the situation? How did you enjoy it? And so what happens is these young men, actually they're boys, adolescents, they're starting to become aware of their own unique strengths. And so because adolescent athletes get a lot of validation for their athletic prowess, but don't necessarily get a lot of validation for who they are as a person. And so what we want to do is bring that to life. And so that's just one way that we actually start focusing on the whole person, not just the person as athlete.
Now, as a coach of this group, and I suppose it's a question that demands an honest answer here. As a coach of this group, and when being a coach, you're invested in technique, in tactics, in physicality. As a coach of this group, doing that session, taking time to talk to a player about their strengths, taking time to have them in the room talking amongst themselves, does that cause some stress in your mind and through your body? Because there may be an element of, well, we should be out on the pitch, doing some activities, doing some, I don't like to use the word drills, so doing some activities, working on the X's and O's, working on acquiring skill. Does that cause any stress, Steve?
I don't think so. And in fact, all the evidence to me has been, and that's coming directly from players and parents, is that are actually investing in the people, not just the athlete. And that's because, as you well know, Dan, the number of people who make it to the top end of the triangle in any elite sport is fairly minimal. And so at 16 years of age, the people who are going to make it at EPL or, English rugby or, NRL is a fairly small number from the number of participants. So what we're really doing, we're saying, look, we understand what the participation numbers look like. We understand what the progression numbers look like. So we're investing in you as a person, irrespective of whether you're going to make that top end of the triangle or not. And I think that's a really powerful message, because what you're really saying there is we don't just value, the potential economics of you as a player, i.e. performance, but we actually value the psychological contract as well. And so we're going to invest in you as a person. We're going to treat you with trust and fairness, and we recognise that you may or may not, make it to the top. But that doesn't matter to us. What matters is you and your teammates as people as well.
I asked you that question because, again, coming back to the people who are likely listening into this, a lot of what we're talking about doesn't happen because of fear. And it's fear revolving around three areas, in my opinion. It's fear that this stuff isn't important, that it doesn't bear relationship with technical, tactical and physical capabilities. It's fear around competence, as in coach competence. I, as a coach, don't have the competence to deliver this stuff. And it's fear around time, which is what I was alluding to in that question. I don't have the time to do this. My time needs to be spent out on the pitch. And I think those three fears mediate the coach's behaviour, or the coach's decision-making around delivering anything to do with well-being and mainstream performance psychology.
Yeah, and I think you're exactly right. I think, seeing the relative value, having doubts about competence and, considering the trade-offs on time are exactly the reasons why many coaches would be reluctant to invest in well-being or performance psychology for that matter. But my observation, and I've spent a lot of time in my early career in sport and elite sport, performance psychology, then, coming back to it some years later, what I noticed is a generational shift. And what I noticed is that the coaches who may not be in the head coach role or the national coach roles now, but are probably the assistant coaches or the younger coaches on the way up, have a very different attitude. And so what I'm seeing is a changing of the guard, where people are much more not only open to it, but they see this as mandatory. And I think it's a slow transition, but in my view, we're actually in the middle of the transition now. And this relates back to the earlier point that I was probably poorly attempting to make, was that part of the problem is that with this mainstream pathological approach to psychology, it has made a lot of people in sporting environments very cautious. And as a consequence, very reluctant to get involved in well-being and performance psychology because psychology was this scary thing that wasn't available, and I didn't know how it worked. And even if I did know how it worked, I'm not sure I could do it. And I've been a big believer for a long time that the best person and the best place for the embedding of these things are through the coaches, and having the coaches with the skills. And this is something else we've been working on with New South Wales Rugby in their high performance unit, is embedding this knowledge and these skills in coaches so they can deliver some of the content. And I think that's a really important part of, making the shift in elite sporting organisations.
Through the coaches, how much can the coaches actually do, Steve? Where the lines of competence lie, in your opinion?
I think the more that, if we're talking, and perhaps there are two conversations here, one which is well-being and one which is performance psychology. I think in both places, coaches can add incredible value just with advocacy alone. Just by saying, look, I believe in these things and I'm committed to them. And, for example, I'm going to make time in the agenda because I know it's important. Or I'm actually going to get skilled up in the area of talking about mindset because I know how much that plays into athletes' willingness to put in the required effort or to persevere or to ask for feedback. Or I'm going to be the advocate going back to the sporting code and say we need to have this sports psychology person on our team because they add significant value. So I think from a performance psychology, the more the coach can be involved, the better. But I'm not suggesting for a second that coaches become psychologists, because they're not. But there are a lot of things that, from both a well-being and from a performance psychology perspective, that coaches could and can and do. And the best coaches are, in my view, great psychologists. They just don't happen to have the qualification that sits alongside their name. I believe in the vast majority of cases, with the right information, there are many people who could add a lot of value in both psychological terms and well-being terms. And I don't know if you've had a chance to read Johan Hari's fantastic book, Lost Connections. Go on, I haven't. But to me, it perfectly describes the dilemma that psychology has faced over the last 100 years, where it really did lose its way, and as a consequence, it confused people. And I think we're starting to see the emergence of a new psychology now, which is more about and for people, which is more positive, which is more optimistic, and which enables people to have much more control. And, if I just give the example back to the well-being in the NRL, we actually sit down with the player and we've got a well-being model, and we've got a series of questions. We've got 8 dimensions on our well-being model. So that's physical, psychological, family relationships, culture, spirituality, careers, and finances. And we ask them a series of questions, and we say, what are the areas that you'd like to focus on? So rather than telling or doing for, we say, where would you like to focus? And we come up with this idea of a wellbeing heat map. And we say, what are the areas you'd like to focus on? And then they identify some areas, and we have a discussion around that. And then we sit down and we set some goals around that and develop some plans. And then they've got their own customized wellbeing plan. And it's the plan that they decided to invest in. And it's a plan which helps them align more to what their personal values are and to what their character strengths are. And so for me, part of this is almost democratizing psychology in a positive way and saying, look, if we can share the knowledge and the skills, then everybody's going to be better off.
So in essence, you're helping the player take charge of their well-being development. You're empowering them to come up with their choices.
So they sit with a person who's qualified in holistic well-being, so people who've been through the training, and they have a discussion about, well, I'd really like to work on my self-awareness because I find myself getting frustrated or upset and I don't know why. All right, so then there are things that we can do there. And part of the process that we train these people, wellbeing managers, to do is to do what's called a life story interview, where they sit down with the player and they learn about their life and their stories and some of the challenges they faces and the high points and the low points and what their plans are for the future. And in sitting through that exercise, which takes roughly 45 minutes, they get to know the person. They get to know what's important to them. They get a strong sense of their values. And that allows alignment between, well, if they're going to focus in these areas for their wellbeing plan, well, there should be some alignment there. But it's only possible if, one, you know how to, conduct that life story interview, and two, if you've actually done the training, and three, that you can actually hold a conversation around what's going to be important for this person in their wellbeing. So it's actually looking at holistic wellbeing and saying, well, for you as a whole person, what's important and how can we help you move more toward what's important to you? Because we know that's going to have a very positive impact on the person. The other thing we know, Dan, is this is going to be the most protective thing for a person's mental health. So, and everybody talks about they want to do more, they want to invest in mental health, but we don't seem to be doing the very thing that's most protective, which is give people the knowledge and skills so they can take care of their own well-being. And what we've invested a huge amount of time in is awareness raising around mental ill health. But that's not protecting us, that's not helping us. That's like saying, okay, the problem, we've got a problem with car accidents, so we'll send more ambulances. And what I'm saying is, why don't we go to the other end of the continuum and start saying, well, if we know flourishing and, holistic well-being and investing in that knowledge and those skills is protective, why don't we start doing those things? And that was what was the burning desire to set up the Wellbeing Science Institute and actually set up this holistic wellbeing program for athletes.
And I think, Steve, that kind of language normalises performance psychology and well-being within a sporting environment, no matter what that environment is, whether it's a participative environment, whether it's an elite environment, it normalises. And as you were speaking there, I was thinking about my experiences over the past 15 years and how that abundance of language around problem. Psychology is for problem athletes. Psychology is for people with problems. Has led to a situation in sport where performance psychology, sports psychology has become isolated.
Yeah,
isolated
I agree.
Rather than integrated.
Exactly. And so it becomes a bolt-on or an add-on, not integrated to the way in which the philosophical view we have of athletes, the way in which coaches see themselves as leaders of systems, the way in which coaching and support staff and the high performance staff see a whole person, not just an athlete, and the way in which people who work with athletes on either performance or well-being are able to transfer knowledge and skills. And by taking that very different approach, all of a sudden it's not as scary, not as problem-focused, it's not as negative. It's actually seen as a benefit. And the beauty I see of it, Dan, is that when you're helping athletes in this way, you feel much better about what you do because you're making a real difference to people's lives, not just their athletic performance.
And I think what I'd like to say, Steve, if I may, and I'm not so much speaking to you, I'm addressing the audience, is that, and I come back to this point on fear of competence. Don't start, if one sees this as let's use the metaphor of a jigsaw puzzle. Psychology, this side of things can be as complex as you want it to be. It really can, and I suppose it's our job to have that 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle and to fill in every piece as we in our respective roles as psychologists become more competent in what we do within the frameworks we use, reading the theories, applying evidence-based practice to what we do. That's our job, is to have a 1,000-piece puzzle, in my opinion. And I think coaches are fearful because they think they've got to have this 1,000-piece puzzle to be able to do it with competence, to do it competently. And I just don't think that's the case, Steve. I think they can have a 4-piece jigsaw puzzle. They can just fill little bits in at a time with this puzzle, because when you put one piece of the jigsaw puzzle in, then you're helping your players. It could be one thing. It could be one thing during your activities from a communication perspective. It could be one little, dare I say it, classroom session. It could be just getting your players doing what you said, Steve, which is to go online and do the character strengths based questionnaire. It's just one thing, isn't it, Steve? Just one thing this week, one thing next week can make an enormous difference to your practice as a coach.
Enormous difference, because one of the things, just take the character strengths example, is that then everybody understands each other better as people. And so that's going to make for better group communication, better one-on-one communication. If you've got an issue that you need to raise with an athlete, you can actually think about, well, what's important to this person? So how can I frame the conversation in a way that's going to resonate with the person, but also tap into what's important to them? So there are lots and lots of benefits. Now, likewise with sleep, sleep means, not just better performance, but it means better mood, it means better self-regulation, it means better relationships. And so there are all these benefits. And my advice to coaches, whether they be seasoned professionals or whether they're, volunteers at the local club, is try and think about how you can weave holistic wellbeing practices into your team, into your organisation, into your club, because it will pay huge dividends, not just in terms of participation, but in terms of progression and in terms of performance.
I just want to finish off with some skill acquisition stuff just for a few minutes, but just before I do, again, as you're speaking, it reminds me of some of the conversations I'm having on a day-to-day basis with coaches who bemoan a lack of leaders in their team. And I'm talking about elite level, but it could be developing elite as well. I think there's a lot of language these days around millennials not having leadership capabilities. There's a lot of, dare I say, old school mentality around. I hear a lot of, well, Dan, we don't make them like we used to, and everyone's too scared to lead now, and the younger generation, etc., etc. And whether that's true or not, I don't know. But the life does change, society does change, and people's attitudes change. But what I know, coming back to your point about striving to build in little processes into your day-to-day coaching culture, into your activities, into your day-to-day communication as a coach through your organisation. It's the same as something like leadership, in my opinion, Steve, in as much as I say to these coaches, okay, fine, you've got a squad of 15, 20 players, and you're bemoaning a lack of leaders. But what actually are you doing? What opportunities are you giving players to lead? What actual opportunities are you giving? Because a lot of your coaching is top-down. A lot of your coaching is directive. So you're not helping players experience leadership, and it's the same with the well-being piece. What opportunities are you giving players to experience, whether it's tools, techniques, just little chances to improve, develop, build their well-being?
Yeah, and look, I agree with you very strongly. When people ask me about the leadership question, the first question I ask them is, okay, can you just define what leadership means to you? And often people struggle just with that simple definition. And then if they can come up with the definition of leadership, then I tend to introduce them to self-determination theory, because I really believe that effective coaches understand what the philosophical underpinnings of self-determination are in coaching, and that is autonomy, competence and relatedness. And if you can give your athletes autonomy, i.e. help them make more decisions and better decisions by themselves without you yelling at them or talking to them, if you can help them become better players and help them move toward their potential as people, and if you can understand what's meaningful to them and link what you're doing to that, you're going to get so much better outcomes. So I think I'm a big believer in sport's potential for social change. And, I've had people also say to me about millennials, and I say, I just simply don't believe that. I do say to them, what I believe millennials are looking for is better leadership. Yeah. And if they get better leadership, they'll respond accordingly.
Just to finish off, and it's kind of going back to the importance piece. Again, I am a coach under 12 or under 14 or under 16 level. I'm listening to this. I'm listening to you, Steve. I'm listening to you, Dan. This is a nice little conversation, but I still want to be convinced that this is important, because ultimately I've still got to help my players acquire skill. Do you feel that the work you do at your institute helps coaches to help players acquire skill? How does that work within your tools and techniques at the institute?
We train people who are interested in holistic athlete well-being development. That's what we do. And in some cases, that's people who already work in athlete well-being in elite or professional sport. In some cases, it's people who are coaches of elite or professional athlete development. In some cases, it's player agents, because they know the better they can care for their athletes' well-being, the more likely that they're going to stay with them, and the more likely is that they're going to have a positive brand and a longer career because they've got things in balance. So that's one way in which we do it. But we also do a lot of work in consulting to sporting organisations, both front and back office, around what effective systems and what effective leadership is in sporting organisations. And specifically working a lot with coaches and educating them on what effective coaches do. And I still think whether people are volunteers or whether they're professional coaches, there's a massive opportunity for learning. And I think the big shift that's coming in the workplace, and I include sport in this, is that everybody's going to be expected to be a lifelong learner. And to me, that's the great opportunity about sport and its potential impact for when people do learn to influence social change in a positive way.
If people are interested, Steve, and they want to get in contact, which no doubt they will, because this has been a really engaging conversation for an hour or so, how can they get in contact with you? What's your website, your email, and do you use social media?
Website is Wellbeing Science Institute.com. All the contact details are there. Obviously, we're on LinkedIn and Facebook and Twitter, and and the like. I'd be happy to have a chat to anybody around the program, the training course, and just generally philosophically around what well-being is or can potentially mean. We're hoping to get to the UK the next 12 months and run our first elite athlete wellbeing management program there. So I'll keep you posted, and I'm hoping that's going to be finalised in the next 2 months, Dan.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Well, we look forward to welcoming you to the UK. Steve Johnson, thank you. Thank you so much for your time. I know the Sports Psych Show audience will be really appreciative of that information. Don't be scared, be fearless when it comes to this stuff. Do what Steve said, go online, have a Google, have a play with well-being material. It's so important. You can develop the competence. Begin at the beginning. Just start by getting a little bit of information, and as Steve alluded to there, deliver that in your daily activities. Just one bit of information, just a classroom session, anything that's really simple that will make a difference, and make the time to do that, because it will have a real positive impact on your people, on your players. So that was Steve Johnson, everyone. I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, please leave the Sports Psych Show a rating, and don't forget to subscribe to future episodes. I look forward to seeing you next week. We've got a fantastic guest coming up, so I hope you can tune in then. Goodbye for now.